Okay, so we're going to have a look now at a couple of texts to get us warmed up. So I'll be sharing something with you.
I finally have the book.
Oh, great. Yeah, good.
Book. Yay.
Yeah, I have the book as well.
That's good news.
Oh.
All right. So on the screen is a little text called Covent Garden description. Can you see that?
Yep. Yes.
Good, good, good. So we're going to have a look at this, and this is actually a non-fiction text. Okay, this is non-fiction. So the person is describing. He's describing Covent Garden Market in London. Okay, so whilst you're looking at that, have a think about. You can't highlight, obviously, because you haven't got it in front of you, but have a think about if there are any interesting words or phrases that stand out to you. Have a think about when it might have been written, and any language features that the writer has used. Okay. So we've got somebody coming in again, hopefully, to share it again. Hello there. I hope you're in this time. Can you hear me? Oh.
I don't see anything either.
Me too. I don't see.
No, I've had to unshare it because I can't let people in and share. They won't see anything. So I have to reshare every time somebody joins, which is why I like people to be punctual. Ellen, are you with us? Yes, I think you are, aren't you? So hopefully everybody's in now, and we'll start again. So I was just about to share with you this nice little text about Covent Garden Market in London. So we'll read it through and then talk about the points at the bottom. But just hold those in your mind as you're reading. Covent Garden Market and the avenues leading to it are thronged with carts of all sorts, sizes, and descriptions, from the heavy, lumbering wagon with its 4 stout horses to the jingling costermonger's cart with its consumptive donkey. The pavement is already strewed with decayed cabbage leaves, broken hay bands, and all the indescribable litter of a vegetable market. Men are shouting, carts backing, horses neighing, boys fighting, basket women talking, pie men expatiating on the excellence of their pastry, and donkeys braying. So have a look at that and think, what are interesting, maybe odd words and phrases? When do you think it might have been written? And are there any language features? Is the writer using any kind of tricks and techniques of language in order to get the experience across to the reader? Have a look at it.
The word jingling, that's the onomatopoeia.
It is. That's brilliant. Yes, well done, Lucy. It is an example of onomatopoeia. Yeah. Which, of course, is what? What does onomatopoeia do?
Make us think about the sound.
Yes. Yes. It brings to life the sound that we would hear if we were actually present. It makes us feel and think that we hear the noises around us. So jingling. I mean, the word jingling only means the noise that is caused by usually bits of metal clanking together and jingle, jingle, jingle. Yes, absolutely.
From the text, it seems that it's situated like maybe in the late 19th, early 20th century, because they're talking about the carriages and horses and more things from the past.
Yes, now that's interesting. So you're saying that some of the details in the text would lead us to think that it was not certainly contemporary because of the carts of all sizes
Yeah, donkeys in the streets.
Yeah, we don't see them too often nowadays, do we? The stout horses, the consumptive donkey, bless it. Yeah, other donkeys braying and so on. So yes, we're definitely not in modern times. So you think late 19th, early 20th? Anybody else? Anybody got some ideas about when this might have been?
I have to agree with that. Yeah, it does seem like, yeah, late 1900s and stuff like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Early
I mean, I definitely see it. I do like the word costermonger though. It's a really cool word.
Costermonger.
It's not used often, I don't think.
Not a lot. Not a lot
Mm.
these days. Go on.
1800s.
It's definitely, yes, it is a 19th century text.
Yeah.
It's sort of in the middle years of the 19th century, sort of 1840s, 50s, that
Yeah.
sort of time. And I can't remember now exactly the date, but it wouldn't have changed that much between, say, 1830 and 1920, really. You might have got a few petrol-driven cars and lorries in the early 20th century, but still most of that stuff was done by horse-drawn wagon or by people pushing carts, hand carts. As it in some markets today, you still see people pushing their carts into the market and then setting up their stalls. So yeah, that's great. Yeah. Did anybody notice any? So we had the interesting word costermonger. Any others? Well, we do.
We can see the list over here as well. Men are
Mhm.
shouting,
Yes,
cars backing, horses neighing, and so on.
yes. And so you've got a lot of stuff going on, and one of the ways the writer brings it all to life for us is just to use a very, very overloaded sentence, which, as you say, is listing things you can see, things you can hear, things that are happening.
Mm.
Yeah. In fact, this paragraph of writing is only 2 sentences. The
Oh.
first sentence ends at donkey. The second sentence is the last sentence. That is one long sentence. It's broken up with commas and a semicolon, but it isn't separate sentences. So yeah, it's just a long, breathless list of all the stuff you can see and smell and hear. So it's all to do with the senses. The pavement is already strewed with decayed cabbage leaves, broken hay bands, this indescribable litter of a vegetable market. Men are shouting, carts are backing, horses neighing, boys fighting, basket women talking, pie men expatiating on the excellence of their pastry, and donkeys braying. Yeah. So
Expatiating is an interesting word.
expatiating you don't hear too often, do you either? So there are some interesting words. Now, costermonger is a. Does anybody know what a costermonger is?
I do. I
Go
know what
on.
it is.
Yeah, let us
It's the
know.
person who sells vegetables. I know that
That's
one.
right. Yeah, I
Yeah.
guess we would call them a greengrocer now.
Mm.
But they were people who sold all sorts of things, but mostly fruit and vegetables, which of course you might well find in a market of like Covent Garden Market, which there's a small market in Covent Garden now still that sells fruit and vegetables. It used to be the main hub for selling fruit and vegetables to the entirety of England, really.
New Zealand, I didn't know.
Yeah,
I've
In
never been there
London.
actually.
it was the main hub. Now, it's also next door to the market. There's the Royal Opera House. So if you wanted to go and see opera and ballet, that right next door to going to Covent Garden, it depended on what you were going to do down. If you were going down the market, or whether you were going to go and watch the ballet. So it's right next door to each other. And if anybody's seen Mary Poppins, not Mary Poppins,
Love Mary Poppins.
My Fair Lady, she's selling roses to the gents who are going to the opera at Covent Garden, and her father works in the market. Yeah, so it's that sort of world that's being brought to life for us.
Mm.
So we have mentioned some of the features. Sorry, I have to keep knocking it out and putting it back on again, because every time I look away, it goes off as well. So costermonger, we got expatiating really means just to be praising and giving up a sort of like a testimony of praise to anything. So it's usually we would be talking about maybe even religion, you know, expatiating God or whatever. But in this case, it's the excellence of their pastry. Of course, pie men will want to say how excellent their particular pastry is, because pie men are simply men who sell pies. They probably have a basket full of pies on their heads, and they'd be going, "Come and get my pies best in London," and all that sort of stuff. You know, and if you've seen Oliver, they probably sing about it as well.
Hey Sam, may I have some more? I know that much. I haven't actually seen that though. Apparently, great movie though.
It's great.
Mm.
It's a great.
Mm.
And another thing that this has in common with Oliver is that the man writing here is Charles Dickens.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
I
So
hadn't
you got.
noticed.
So Charles Dickens is writing about Covent Garden. This is his own realistic take of what going down to Covent Garden was like. He obviously is much more famous for his fiction, but he wrote a lot of non-fiction as well, and he often comes up. He did travel writing. He went to America. He went to other places. So you quite often get bits of Dickens coming up as the 19th century text. Any other words then? Well, consumptive. The poor donkey is consumptive. What's wrong with a donkey if it's got consumption?
Oh, that's what it means. Okay.
To be consumptive was actually to have a lung disease. It was something that would make you cough, get short of breath. It would be everything from asthma all the way through to lung cancer might be called consumption. It was a very common ailment. A lot of people spent months, years lying on their beds with consumption, getting terribly pale and delicately dabbing at their lips with a handkerchief. It actually became kind of fashionable, weirdly, to be a bit consumptive, very pale and a bit weak, especially for ladies. And, oh, poor me, sort of thing. But it was also a serious disease that was quite deadly, and unfortunately, these working animals in places like the markets, even down the coal mines, they used donkeys to pull the great carts of coal. It was a fact of everyday life that horses and ponies and donkeys were used in their millions as the main form of locomotion. I mean, trains had steam engines attached to them, but in the streets, they were as common as cars are now. So owning and having horses and ponies and donkeys wasn't seen as being a luxury hobby. It was simply a fact of life that many people would rely on these animals. And you know, they were treated as working animals, and they were disposed of quite brutally, you know, just as we get rid of an old car or an old bike that's no longer functioning, is too expensive to look after, you just get rid of it. They would just get rid of the poor old donkeys. And this one, Dickens probably thought it was consumptive because it was coughing, and so he could hear it wheezing and coughing and being very much on its last legs. Yeah. But he juxtaposes, puts alongside the image of the 4 stout horses. Now these are the big horses, you know, the big wagon pulling horses, you know, 6 foot or more at the shoulder, the Shire horse type that you can still see in sort of ceremonial processions and so on. They were very common in their day for deliveries. They were the juggernaut engines of their day. You know, if you're going to move house or something, you might have a couple of shire horses pulling a wagon along to take your furniture away and so on. Even when I was a kiddie, the coal was still delivered door to door by men, and they had the coal on the back of a horse-drawn wagon, and that was in the 1960s, for goodness sake. Yeah. So the idea of seeing working animals in the street is still within living memory by quite a degree. So just as we have all sorts of different vehicles, so there were carts of all sorts, sizes and descriptions. Language features, you're right, it is this building pictures with senses. The smell of the decayed cabbage leaves, the scene of the litter, and then the noises, the men shouting, the horses neighing, the boys fighting, the basket women talking, the piemen expatiating, and the donkeys braying. Braying is the actual correct term, although it is onomatopoeia. This is the correct term for a noise that donkeys make. E-oing is slang. Braying is actually what they do, and donkeys bray, and so do trumpets. Trumpets bray. That's that noise. It's bray, and donkeys also bray. So that's what they do. And of course, what he's presenting is a great long list, a jumble of sounds, a jumble of noises, a jumble of experiences to take in. It's almost like overload. It's just such a busy place. It's just an extraordinary hub of business and all sorts of stuff going on. And it's exciting, and it's smelly, and it's noisy, and he's given us a real image of life. Many times during this course, I will say to you that the examiners are, in your writing, they're looking for rich description. And when I say rich description, it's this sort of thing I mean. This is this is not a narrative. There's no story going on. It's just like it's just like he took a movie camera with a good sound microphone on it down there, which of course didn't exist at the time, and he just preserved what it was like for you, but he did it entirely in words, and it's using all those tricks that a writer has at their disposal to create a descriptive experience for the reader. And that's one of the great things that we're looking for, hopefully in the writing we look at, but also in the writing that you produce. So we're not as interested in storytelling as we are in describing, because the examiners want to see what you can do with language. And you don't have a lot of time in the exam to actually do any writing either. So that is a wonderful piece of 19th century text from one of the greatest 19th century writers. So I thought I'd take a moment now to share with you an overview. It's a ridiculously truncated overview, but well done, Monica, you're in. It's a truncated overview, but hopefully it will give a flavour of the 19th century for you. It's only a beginning point, and I emphasise that to really get a handle on feelings about the 19th century, you have to do your own research, whether that's watching films, TV shows, reading books and stories. But let's have a look at this one. It's really just a sort of a timeline of things that happened during that era.
Excuse me, Graham.
Yes.
Is Oliver Twist for the same era?
Do you say Oliver Twist?
Yeah.
Yeah, Oliver Twist was written in the early 19th century, or the sort of 1830, 1840, but it was set maybe 20 years earlier. But it is it's set in the early 19th century, and it's a very good bringing to life of what the back streets of London would have been, and other cities would have been like in that era. the poverty, the crime, the cruelty of the punishments and so on. Yeah, it's very different from what it was like, say, at the end of the 19th century. The 19th century is a period of quite enormous and very fast change. So, yeah, no, you're welcome. So if I can just get it to work, there we go. Can you see this timeline of 19th century?
Yep.
Yeah,
That's it.
everybody. Yep. You just shout at me if I ever go off on a. I have actually spent 10 minutes or so talking about a presentation, and then somebody said we can't see the presentation, which is right. So conveniently, here we are living in the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom was created in 1801, which is the first year of the 19th century. So the Act of Union in 1801 brought together England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, the whole of Ireland, as one nation state, as one legal entity, the nation state of the United Kingdom. And things have changed since then, of course. More than half of Ireland has left the United Kingdom, and you know, there are threats to other parts of the UK going, but that's where the United Kingdom really starts. Prior to that, England and Scotland were in an earlier version of a United Kingdom, which was called Great Britain, and of course the King or Queen of England and Scotland have been the same person since James I of England and James VI of Scotland. So the Union Jack represents, or the Union flag rather, represents the United Kingdom by having the crosses of various patron saints. Did you know that? So which patron saints can we see here? What about this big straight up add it sign cross? Who's that?
St. George.
St. George, that's right. That's the flag of England. Then we have the white multiplication sign cross against a blue background. And who is that? Which country would that be representing?
Scotland.
Scotland, that's right. And it is the flag of St. Andrew. It's St. Andrew. St. George is England. St. Andrew is Scotland. St. Andrew is the St. Andrew who was one of the disciples of Jesus. He never came to.
I know that much.
He never came to Scotland, but he was crucified on a multiplication sign cross, not the
X cross, yeah.
not the up and down cross like Jesus was. So that's why he has a saltire, which is what that's called.
I know that much because I'm a Christian.
All right. And then there is this thin red multiplication sign. Yeah. And that is representing which country?
Wales.
No, Ireland. Because that is the cross of Saint Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland.
Saint Paddy.
Wales is not represented on the flag, and never has been. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Wales, you have the kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and the Principality of Wales, which has been appended to England for nearly 1,000 years, and wasn't until devolution considered to be a separate nation. So they don't even get a look in on the flag, I'm afraid. So something that dominated British life and the whole of Western Europe in the early years of the 19th century were the Napoleonic Wars. Just really a title that you can put on the wars that seem to surround the the monarchies of Europe attempts to try and unseat Napoleon from Republican France. And from Britain's point of view, some of the big events of that time were the battles that happened during that era and the heroes that were represented there. So we have this lovely oil painting of the death of Nelson, Horatio Nelson, there being killed at the height of the battle, which is called the Battle of Trafalgar, which was a sea battle off the coast of Spain. And so 1805, the Royal Navy defeats a French and Spanish fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar. And he got this enormous column built for him in Trafalgar Square, which you can see to this day, and that's him at the top, Nelson. Horatio Nelson was the biggest celebrity in Britain. And I mean celebrity in the modern sense. People wrote gossip columns about him. He had his picture drawn all the time. He was in the newspapers all the time, especially when he took up with a lady called Lady Hamilton, a married lady who was considered the most beautiful woman in Europe. And the two of them were this golden couple having this amazingly scandalous affair where they went round. They were both married to other people, and yet they were seen everywhere, and their love story was being tittle-tattled about. They were the just basically the 19th century version of celebrities, but they were impossibly glamorous. And of course, he went out and fought sea battles. Never mind being an influencer on YouTube, he actually went out and fought sea battles. Sorry about that. I seem to have dropped out. I don't know if you have. So we'll get back into it. Why am I mentioning this? Well, apart from it just being a famous event in the 19th century, the fact that Britain was embattled, was fighting a war primarily to try and re-establish the idea of monarchy and push back the tide of democracy in Europe. But they, it was a time where a lot of men were being swept up into the army and so on, and it was a time of instability and war in the first quarter of the 19th century. How did ordinary people dress? Well, of course, ordinary people come in different types. And so you have the upper classes, the middle classes, and the working classes. And so these were typical middle to upper class gentlemen and ladies. You can see that men not 1,000 miles away from what a sort of a posh suited person would wear these days, but they were a little bit tight around the trousers and so on. A lot of these were derived from riding wear. The ladies, now we did have gowns all the way down past the ankles, no legs on display, but that didn't mean that they couldn't show off quite a lot of chest, let's say. Their embonpoint was certainly, that was the sexual display of the time. And so there was modesty in as much as the skirts went down to the ground, but in this early part of the 19th century, it was still like a hangover from the slightly more naughty late 18th century. There was certainly quite a lot of breast exposed. Ordinary men, working men, wore rougher garments made of cheaper materials. They had to keep the dirt and they had to keep the soot out of them. They also had to ward off the cold because they would mainly, a lot of them, work outside. So that's the difference in styles and dress. Unlike now, where you might see Bill Gates wearing jeans and a t-shirt, you wouldn't really have got the rich, the nobility dressing like working men, or vice versa. Here's one of the most famous and greatest writers of the 19th century. She only made it into the very early 19th century, Jane Austen. But some of her greatest work was published in the 19th century. So you know, Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Persuasion, and so on. And very close together. She just threw those novels out. And so Jane Austen is one of the most important writers of the early 19th century. The Napoleonic Wars carried on. Well, Napoleon was defeated. He went away to Elba, came back from the island of Elba, got his army back up again, and sort of started it all over again. and he was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. As indeed, Napoleon was defeated, as Abba told us. Napoleon Bonaparte was then sent off to St. Helena Island in the middle of the Atlantic, where he died 6 years later. After that, you get a comparative period of peace in Europe for the first time, maybe in a couple of 100 or 300 years. Another great writer of the early 19th century here, Mary Shelley, the wife of the great poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who in the revolutionary years of the French Revolution in the late 18th century had been one of the very earliest feminist thinkers. Rachel.
Isn't that sorry, I'm just saying, I'm hearing Mary Shelley, I'm thinking that what that tongue twister was about, the she sells seashells on the seashore. Is that her or is that not?
I don't think I don't think she went in.
No, oh, maybe it's not. Maybe it's someone else. My bad.
Maybe we can find out.
What it was. I was just wondering what era this was. Sorry, is this like Victorian, Edwardian, Georgian? I'm wondering what era this is. Like, you know.
Now this is Georgian. Yeah, this is Georgian. Okay. So it should really have said that the kings. We had a lot of kings in the first part of the 19th century. You had the rather elderly George III on the throne when it opens. Then his son followed, who was George IV, and he died without any children. So they went back to his uncle, the brother of George III, who was called William IV. William IV had never intended to be king. He didn't know anything about it. And he just sort of bumbled along. He actually just liked sort of sailing boats. They called him Sailor Billy. And he died without any children as well. And so it went to his niece, Queen Victoria.
Oh, that was his niece. Oh, right. Okay. That's interesting.
So 1818, Mary Shelley created Frankenstein. You thought it was Dr. Frankenstein. No, she created Dr. Frankenstein, and Dr. Frankenstein created the creature. That's Boris Karloff in the classic 1931 version, but bears very, very little relation to Mary Shelley's monster. But again, it's one of the most influential books of all time. Politics, very fiery era. In 1819, we had the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester. There was a protest of people who were wanting lower food prices. They wanted more democracy. Ordinary working people were not allowed to vote, and food had been priced out of their hands, and people were actually starving. And it sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? But that gathering there in Manchester on that day, they actually unleashed the soldiers on horseback with swords against them. And they were sliced down. So hundreds were injured and 11 died at the Peterloo Massacre, for asking for democracy and representation for the poorer people. In 1833, the British, well, what wasn't quite yet called the British Empire, but the whole of the world that was controlled by Britain banned the practice of slavery. So in 1833, the Abolition of Slavery Act freed all slaves in the British Empire, regardless of where they were, whether they were in Jamaica, whether they were in Africa themselves, there were very few slaves in Britain, very few African slaves in Britain. But that was the act. Remember that it was another 33 years before slavery was abolished in America. In 1825, steam engines were invented. Not invented really. In 1825, the world's first steam locomotive passenger service began. Now, there it is. You've got Stockton and Darlington up in the north of England were connected by a train service. You had to sit in the open air, so if it rained, tough. And the smoke would get in your hair and all the rest of it. But you could get between these two towns in a matter of minutes, where it would have taken half a day riding previously. this is beginning of the modern age of being able to travel quickly. Until then, you could only go as fast as a horse could drag you. The first proper police force, the first professional police force, begins in 1829. Robert Peel, who later became Prime Minister, set up the Metropolitan Police Force. And that's that's what they looked like. This, of course, is a
That's
little.
why they call it the Peelers.
Yeah, they were called the Peelers because of Robert
It's the
Peel. They were
Peelers.
also called Bobbies,
Yeah.
again because of the word Robert. So yeah, Bobbies and Peelers, and
Mhm.
they were meant to be incorruptible. Ha ha. Because they worked for a wage. Up until then, you had agents and maybe court officials and so on, the Bow Street runners and people like that, who were all a bit dodgy. Nothing dodgy at all about the Metropolitan Police, as we know from current news broadcasts. But that's the uniform they used to wear. This is obviously later because this is a photograph, and in 1829 they didn't have any photographs. And then in 1837, the era-defining personage of Queen Victoria comes to the throne. There she is, 1819 to 1901 she lived. So you can see that she was barely 17 when she became queen. And again, she wasn't born to be queen. She was, if either of the previous two kings had had children, she wouldn't have ever become queen. And then she sees in the rest of the century. How did they dress then in the early Victorian era? So now we're into the second third of the 19th century. You can see that the men's clothing has changed a little bit, but not very much. Jackets are maybe coming in a little bit shorter, and they're still wearing these ridiculous top hats. The ladies' clothing, now the rather generous display of of chest has diminished a little bit. They're still wearing very modest clothes down to their feet, but nothing modest at all about the designs on these clothes, particularly this thing at the back, which was called the bustle. And this really was to accentuate the idea of them having bottoms. So
Can I just add something about the
course
the chest
yes,
being
of course
exposed
you
like
can.
that? There was a
Yes.
practical bit to it as well. It's
Ah,
because they were wearing a lot of layers
yes.
and they were very hot and really tight. So to basically for them to be breathing a little bit easier, and they were sweating and stuff. So that was the reason why the chests were quite exposed.
But they got covered up because of modesty later on in the era. The other thing that would have affected their breathing was that you see these
Corsets.
ridiculously thin waists,
That's heavy
which
material.
yeah,
Corsets.
the corsets, which were worn all the way into the 20th century, actually pulled very, very tightly to try and give women this incredible thin waist shape. Was often
Mm.
extremely uncomfortable and actually could cause internal damage if
Oh.
they through wearing them every day. Yeah.
Mm.
And then you see the street urchins, the young lads, and that would hang around the street corners and so on. And at this stage, there still is no free compulsory education for children. So if you were the son of somebody quite wealthy, middle class to upper class, you would probably, if you were a boy, you would probably be sent away to boarding school. If you were a girl, you would probably be educated at home by a tutor, or they called it a governess. But there was very little education at all, except in some charity schools for the children of the poor.
Hmm.
In 1838, so just after Queen Victoria became queen, photography is invented. Unfortunately, not in England, but by our friends across the channel in France, Louis Daguerre. Talbot was close after him, and so we begin to be able to have record of what the world looked like through photography for the first time. We mentioned Charles Dickens. We were reading his little piece about the market. Here he is. His career starts also around about the time Queen Victoria comes to the throne. He was Queen Victoria's favourite writer. We know that because she wrote him fan letters, telling him how wonderful he was. And he encouraged her writing. She used to keep journals, and she did show him some, and he encouraged her to write. But unfortunately, most of them she had most of them destroyed. But she was apparently a very keen writer. But Charles Dickens created a huge canon of incredibly famous novels, short stories, and also non-fiction, travel writing, and contemporary sort of essays about the politics and what was going on around him in England at the time. In 1840, again, the world gets smaller. You were able to buy a postage stamp so that anybody who could afford a penny could send a letter to anywhere in Britain. You know, from one end of the country right up to the islands in the north of Scotland. 1 penny postage stamp. This was the first postage stamp in the world. It has Queen Victoria's face on it, and it was called the penny black. You can get quite a lot of money for one of those if you find it in the attic. Very expensive, yes.
Have a look. Probably not. My nan might have one.
Now, here we begin to think about the cost of the fact that Britain was a powerful country that was using its powers over other countries and other peoples. They often say that England's first colony was Ireland, and here we have an example of a terrible event that happened in Ireland in the 1840s and 50s, where about 1 million people died. And it really kick-started the mass migration of Irish people, mostly coming to Britain and America, and leaving their homeland behind. There was an awful lot of political skullduggery about this. Yes, there was a famine of potatoes caused by a blight, but the landlords in Ireland didn't help the peasants who lived on their land, and hundreds of thousands of them were allowed to die.
Queen Victoria, she didn't do anything, did she? Or
well, Queen Victoria personally, just as our king and our last queen, she was only a political figurehead, really. It's true that the government didn't do very much. The British government didn't do very much to help. Yeah. And of course, this became a great recruitment drive for the movement towards revolution and trying to free Ireland from British control. And of course, the reverberations of that, we still feel them today in the problems that are happening in Northern Ireland. Another group of great British writers from the middle of from the early-ish years of Victoria, the Brontes, and some of their great books. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, as you can see them here, not beautifully well drawn or painted, but the thing that's nice about this is that this painting was done by their brother Branwell. Branwell was the man Bronte, a bit like that bloke in The Cause, he was that blur that you can see in the middle. That's him. He put himself into the painting, but then he took himself out.
Oh no.
Because he knew that everybody would only be interested in seeing them.
Oh, that's really sad.
And apart from doing the occasional painting, he just used to sit in the local pub in Harworth and drink himself silly. So you think he has these 3 very overproductive and famous sisters?
It's not really sad. It's like marketing of that era, isn't it?
Yeah. 1852, you have the toilet. The loo is invented. So the first flushing toilet opens in London in 1852. Yeah, before the 1850s, most people had to use an earth closet, which was an outside toilet that just had soil in it and no water. You know, so you basically and then it was somebody's job to come along and sort of shovel this stuff into a big sort of barrel and take it away. You know? Yeah. And indeed, that's what your back lanes were for. You know. As I said last week, I think the first indoor flushing toilet was Queen Victoria's back in her Isle of Wight residence, and it was gold plated. This is not gold plated, but it's nicely tiled. It's very nice. It's a big step forward in hygiene and you know, public sanitation. It is a major event. You know, one of the first things that goes is sanitation usually when civilizations start to crumble, and it was something great. By the 1850s, Britain had kind of was reaching some kind of a peak in terms of its world influence and power, and Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, who was a German gentleman, wanted to show off to the world how great Britain and its empire were. And so they had constructed this enormous glass house. It was entirely made of glass and metal. And inside you had all sorts of different attractions and shows and displays from all around the empire, and a lot of it was about the technological and scientific achievements of the British. You know, so not just being militarily powerful, but also scientifically leading the world and so on. It was just a big, hey, look at us kind of thing. And the Crystal Palace monument thing that was built there was a huge, I mean, people came from all over the world to come and visit it. It stayed on this site in Hyde Park for a few years. Then it was moved to Alexandra Palace outside, you know, a good deal outside of central London. And then in the 1930s, it burnt down one night, and then it's gone. So there you go. A very, very influential piece of science that was produced in the 1800s was Charles Dickens' On the Origin of Species. The effects, obviously, in terms of science, but in terms of social history, this was a beginning to a process of maybe changing the relationship between ordinary people's conceptions of our place in the world and maybe the place of traditional and religious views of mankind. Hugely influential, one way or the other, depending on your point of view. But it does start to shape the way all of us see the world in a different way. In 1876, Britain formally became an empire. It had been huge, like an empire, for many decades, but Queen Victoria was declared the Empress of India in 1876, and everything that's red on there was part of the British Empire. And it actually did cover more land, you know, land mass than any other empire that had ever existed. It's the biggest empire of all time. But there was lots of little tiny bits around in the Mediterranean, and later on there were bits of South America, Central America, and all over. And this is, of course, also the blueprint for the Commonwealth, because when the empire finished, the Commonwealth was created and still exists as a family of nations who were formerly part of the empire.
Oh. Did she, you know, the title Empress?
Yes.
Where did that come? Did that come from? Empress. Where did they get that title?
It's simply the female version of emperor.
Emperor, of course, of
Yeah.
course. Yeah.
I had no idea. Honestly, I didn't realize she was declared Empress of India.
Yeah.
That's
Oh, Go read your history on that.
Yeah.
It's
And
quite
all British,
controversial.
all the British monarchs up to Queen Elizabeth II were emperors of India. You know, obviously, by the time she became queen, the Empire of India was gone, and India was independent. But her father had been emperor of India. Yeah.
Wow.
Now, I just want to show you a couple of pictures. You can't sum up the empire, you know, the entire experience of the empire, which starts in the 17th century and goes all the way up to 1950 or 1970, really. Our colonization, our taking over of other people's lands, our stealing of their resources, and so on, without showing these two pictures, which I do think this is meant to be, and is really a heroic image of the thin red line. It's called the British soldiers in their red coats. I don't know if they're red so they don't show the blood, but they didn't have this thing about wearing clothes to hide, you know, to blend in. They wore bright red costumes, and here they are fighting the Zulu nation and getting well beaten up for their troubles. This is actually a battle they lost, and was a major setback for them. So we tend not to remember this battle. Rather, we remember the next day, where a group of Zulus attacked a small engineering column who were trying to build a bridge at a place called Rorke's Drift, and that became the film Zulu. But this one, tends to get forgotten. But it was a huge military disaster for Britain. But it just reminds us that there were lots of British young men going down to the, you know, thousands of miles to the tip of Africa and fighting people on their land, on their homeland, you know, and thinking they had the right to take their lands away from them and fight them and kill them in order to keep those lands. You know.
We deserve to lose that one.
And look at the chap reading the paper. He's got one servant to fan him to keep him cool, and another servant to do a pedicure. And this is and this wouldn't have been a duke or an earl. This is just ordinary British living in India. You know, at a time when they saw the entire nation of India, the millions and millions of people, as their servants. It is therefore, I think, sometimes you can detect in 19th century writing, in British writing of the 19th century, a feeling of superiority, a feeling of pride. You know, the idea that we are the kind of the tip top, the chosen, because Britain was totally powerful at that time. Across huge swathes of the earth. Obviously, our position is totally different since the Second World War, but in some quarters, this particular way of seeing the world carries on, and it's very unusual. But where does it come from? It comes from this. But on the plus side, in 1880, compulsory schooling was brought in for all children, girls and boys, under the age of 10.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
One of those things.
So it stopped at 10. It stopped at 10, but this was free and it was compulsory. It was much debated whether it was right to take children, you know, who could be out working, and putting them in school. You know, they was actually losing money for their parents. They could be cleaning windows, they could be going up chimneys, they could be, and instead they were forced to go to school for a few years. And so there was a lot of people in industry, you know, factories that relied on tiny little fingers going into those machines, who didn't like the idea. But this is the beginning of the belief that all children should be able to read and write. And it's particularly important for English because the market for books is going to explode. The market for stories and novels that ordinary people want to read, not just the rich and the highly educated, is going to, in the next 20 years, just explode. Just the sorts of stuff that was being invented in the late 19th century. In 1872, you get bicycles. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invents the telephone.
Telephone.
Now, if you think about the telephone is the beginning of the internet. Cables that connect the entire world, and you can just pick it up here and at the speed of light talk to somebody thousands of miles away. And the internet, when it was invented in the 1950s or 60s, actually went through the telephone wires. Without the telephone, there'd be no internet.
Now I'm wondering what the first conversation was.
But I do know the first ever conversation was between Alexander Graham Bell and his assistant, and who was called Mr. Watson, and he actually was just in the room next door, and he picked up the phone and he says, "Mr. Watson, would you mind coming in?" he didn't say coming into what, he didn't say, but he just asked him to come in. And then hailed him from the other room using the telephone. The first person to talk from London to New York by telephone was Queen Victoria. Yeah.
Interesting.
1881, the first home to use electric light throughout. There had been electric lights used in the streets and in theatres before that, but the first home to use electric light, which belonged to Alexander Armstrong's family up in Northumbria, was 1881.
Wait,
Yeah, yes, that's Alexander Armstrong.
The one that one, literally.
Yeah, his family were great industrialists in the Northeast and hugely rich. Yeah, hugely rich. Here, look at this one for social change, though. In 1883. Married women get the right to have their own property.
Yes.
To own their own property. Until then, if you were married, your husband owned your property. You couldn't own independently. If you died, you could own it, but whilst you were actually married, you didn't have any property rights. And of course, you're nowhere near having the right to vote. That doesn't happen until the 20th century. In 1894, film was invented. Again, well, apparently by French people, but they were good at that sort of thing. So 1890s, we get film. 1895, X-rays were discovered by W.K. Röntgen, and just think how many lives have been saved by X-rays.
Mhm.
And radio is invented by Marconi in 1897.
It sounds
So-
Italian.
He was Italian, yes. Mass communication we're on the dawn of mass communication. The cinema begins in the late 19th century, and of course radio, and then by the beginning of the 20th century you've got mass media. So the modern world really is laid down at the very end of the late 19th century. How were they dressing at the end of the century? Well, men are still wearing fairly tight trousers and tall hats, but these suits are now, and the jackets certainly, are now looking a little bit more modern. Women's clothes have become a lot less cumbersome, a lot slimmer, a lot more stylish, and yeah, they're beginning to lose some of that mid-Victorian censoriousness, but they're still very long, You don't get to see legs very much until the 1920s.
Not even ankles.
I mean,
until after the war, Second War.
after the First War.
The First War, sorry,
yes, you
after
got,
1940.
yes, you get to 1918, yeah. You get the Jazz Age and a lot of what they call flappers who are going around in quite short. I mean, by short, I mean just above the knee, but dancing on tables and not wearing bras and things like that. But look at this. But these ladies at the bottom, these are servants. So these are the ladies of the house, and these are the servants. And the servants are still wearing that mid-Victorian kind of modest way, type of dress.
Cheap material.
And imagine having to dress like that to clean the house.
Ugh.
Probably the
Right.
last of the great Victorian novelists, Thomas Hardy. It says he made it way into the 20th century, but he actually stopped writing novels in 1895. So Jude the Obscure was his last novel. It got such bad press and such heavy criticism. People actually accused him of being mad for writing it.
Oh, no.
And he got it was seen to be obscene, unhealthy, obsessive, weird, and crazy. And he never wrote another novel. He became a poet. He became a very good poet, but he only wrote poetry after 1895. But he did a whole range of brilliant and famous novels. Probably the most famous being Tessa the D'Urbervilles. And that was your Thomas Hardy. Sherlock Holmes.
Yay! Love Sherlock.
A figure of popular fiction, and like I said, the rise of of ordinary people buying books, buying papers which had stories in which they would read every month and so on. Sherlock Holmes was one of the first popular genre heroes of a new genre called crime fiction, and
Love crime fiction.
And there he goes. Probably the most filmed fictional character of all time. I mean, I think there's some contest for it, but he's even whilst Conan Doyle was writing the stories, they were being made into films all over the world. Russian silent cinema made dozens of Sherlock Holmes movies. They loved him over. Yeah. He only wrote
Baskerville.
Yes, Hound of the Baskervilles, that's one of them. He wrote 4 novels. He appears in 4 novels and 56 short stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And but then he's also been written by dozens of other writers over the ages since. The last story was in 1927. The first was in 1887. And he ages. He's one of the few fictional characters who ages during the stories. So by the end, he's an old man, a doddering old man. And in 1887, he's about 30. You know, so he gradually ages in real life terms. So fascinating. And in 1901, just into the 20th century, Queen Victoria dies, and it was one of the huge events. Everybody who was anybody in the world came to her funeral, and it was one of the first big film productions of a real life event, and you can still watch her funeral on YouTube. Strangely enough. So there you are. It was the first big filmed royal event anywhere in the world on the 22nd of January 1901. Okay, so I hope that was interesting and possibly helpful way of looking at the 19th century. When we're reading the pieces of writing that we'll do for practice and for the actual exam, bear in mind the sort of world those people were writing in, and who they were writing for as well. And certainly until you get to the very end of the 19th century, all writing was being aimed at the middle class and the upper class, because the working class couldn't read. So, and even if they could, and some could, they probably couldn't afford to buy the books and the journals that were being published. You know, there were movements amongst trade unions and Christian organizations where they would make books, you know, like little charity libraries and things available to the working class. But actually, because of the lack of education, the vast majority of readers would have been middle class and above until very late in the century. Again, that makes a difference when you start to look at the language that's used. It is a language that seems to exclude, because it's basically saying we know that everybody who's reading this has had quite a high level education, and therefore we can use high level language. When you look at the sort of writing that's being done now, it's more democratic. They are not making those assumptions necessarily, because they know that there are people from, a wide range who are perfectly literate, but obviously may not have the same vocabulary that you would expect. So you look at children's books from the 19th century or even the 20th century, they're incredibly difficult to read.
I
A
suppose
lot,
that's why their language improved as they go
Yeah,
along, because
yeah.
they had to read those books and had
Exactly.
to learn those words.
and a lot of
It's slowed down a bit, hasn't it?
exactly, a lot of 21st century adult readers would actually find things like that pretty daunting. Just the vocabulary, just the use of words. You think, wow, did kids really know these? Well, they were kids who were being schooled rather strictly but they weren't being written for ordinary kids. They weren't being, because they were excluded. So there were a lot of good things, but there were also a lot of really bad things. And that's the way the world has always been, I suppose. But it's just to bear that stuff in mind. Let's take a few minutes break, shall we, to refresh ourselves? And then we'll get back on with the work. 5 minutes? Is 5 minutes long enough?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll see you back here at 7:25.
Okay.
Did you have a question, Lucia?
Yes, I have a question. So, is there any chance that we can download or we can review the PowerPoint you just show us?
Yes, I'll put it when you get into the CovLearn website, you'll be able to see the PowerPoints that I've used, as well as the films that I've the recordings I've produced as well. Okay.
And are we supposed to receive a password or a login?
I did say that I was going to do it, but then I got completely snowed under, and so I hadn't got round to it. And I will try and get round to it tomorrow or Thursday.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm gonna.
Wait, you said 7:25, right? Sorry.